The storm didn't just blanket the town, it buried it alive. Somewhere beneath the endless white, a child's cry had gone silent. Most had given up hope, but one soldier refused. Not because he could see her. Not because he could hear her. But because his dog wouldn't stop digging, even when his paws turned raw and bloody. The storm had raged for hours, turning Miller's Creek into a ghost of itself. Houses vanished under heaps of snow, fences flattened, and trees bent under white weight until they splintered with sharp cracks. The air was so thick with falling flakes it blurred the line between ground and sky. Daniel pulled his scarf higher across his face, every breath burning his lungs. He had seen war zones quieter than this storm. The silence wasn't peace, it was suffocating, oppressive, and dangerous. At his side, Shadow pressed forward, ears pinned, body tense, nose to the wind. The shepherd's fur was caked with frost, his breath steaming, but his pace never slowed. Each step left deep prints in the snow, signs of stubborn life against a world that wanted to erase everything. Daniel's voice cracked against the howl. "You smell her?" Shadow gave no answer, just surged ahead, his head low, his body stiff with focus. Behind them, the world looked empty. The town was gone, buried. And somewhere in that endless white lay Emily, the little girl who hadn't made it home before the blizzard swallowed the valley. Daniel clenched his fists inside his gloves, his mind flashing back to the last words he'd heard from her mother. "Please. Find her." The soldier's boots sank to his shins in the drifts as he fought to keep pace with the shepherd. Each gust of wind pushed him back like an invisible wall, but he didn't dare slow. Emily's small voice haunted him, echoing in his head, laughter in the schoolyard, chatter in the general store, always alive, always bright. To imagine it silenced was unbearable. Shadow stopped suddenly, his body rigid. His paws dug into the snow, head tilting, nostrils flaring. Then, without hesitation, he lunged forward and began digging furiously, snow spraying into the air like white smoke. Daniel stumbled forward, his heart hammering. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd didn't look up. He clawed at the drift with a desperation that bordered on madness, his nails raking, scraping, his chest rumbling with low growls. Each time the snow closed back in, he lunged harder, his paws raw against the ice. Then Daniel heard it. A muffled sound. Weak. Faint. But there. A child's whimper. Daniel dropped to his knees, adrenaline spiking like fire. "Emily," he shouted, his voice hoarse. He clawed at the drift with his bare hands, fingers burning as ice cut his skin. Side by side, man and dog tore at the snow, digging, scraping, refusing to stop. Shadow yelped once as the ice sliced his pads, streaks of red staining the white. But he didn't pause. He dug harder, faster, blood mingling with snow, determination in every stroke. Daniel's throat tightened. "Don't stop, boy. Don't stop." The storm howled louder, as if furious at their defiance. Snow blew sideways, blinding them, filling the hollow they fought to carve. But Shadow wouldn't surrender. His claws struck frozen earth, his teeth bared in a snarl of effort, his entire body trembling with exhaustion. And then, Daniel's hand broke through. His glove brushed fabric. "Emily," he gasped, tearing snow aside. A small arm emerged, limp but warm beneath layers of frost-bitten cloth. Her hand twitched. Barely. But enough. Daniel roared with relief. "She's here." Shadow barked, high and sharp, his muzzle shoving deeper, his bloodied paw scraping at the last barrier of ice. He dragged Snow aside until the child's face appeared, pale, lips blue, but breath trembling from her nose in tiny clouds. Daniel pulled her into his arms, cradling her close against his chest. "Got you," he whispered fiercely. "I've got you." Emily stirred faintly, her eyes fluttering, her lips forming a single broken word. "Cold." Daniel pressed his cheek against her icy hair, his heart tearing in two. "I know, kiddo. I know. We're getting you out." Shadow slumped beside them, chest heaving, paws bleeding freely against the snow. His muzzle pushed against Emily's side, his whine low and steady, as though urging her to stay awake. And though the storm still raged around them, for the first time, Daniel felt its grip falter. The blizzard hadn't won, not yet. Daniel cradled Emily tighter, her small body limp in his arms. Her lips were blue, her breath shallow, barely whispers against the howling wind. Snow clung to her lashes like frost, and every second her skin grew colder. "We've got her," Daniel muttered, his voice cracking. He didn't know if he was talking to Shadow, to Emily, or to himself. "We've got her, but we can't stop now." Shadow stood beside him, chest heaving, paws bleeding crimson trails into the snow. He pressed his muzzle against Emily's arm and whined, then barked sharply into Daniel's face, urging him forward. "I know, boy." Daniel's jaw clenched. "We move." The blizzard roared louder, as though furious at their defiance. Every gust slammed into Daniel's body, threatening to tear the child from his arms. His boots sank into drifts so deep each step felt like wading through quicksand. His legs screamed with exhaustion, but he forced them on, one after another. Emily stirred faintly, her head shifting against his chest. A whisper escaped her lips. "Cold." Daniel's throat tightened. "Stay awake, kiddo. Just a little longer." He pulled her closer, tucking his scarf around her tiny face, sharing whatever heat his body had left. Shadow circled them, pushing his shoulder against Daniel's knees when the soldier faltered, barking when drifts grew too high, darting ahead and then back again like a tireless guide. Blood stained the snow behind him, but his eyes never wavered. Minutes stretched into eternity. Daniel's arms ached, his breath came in ragged bursts, but he refused to loosen his grip. He stumbled once, dropping to one knee, snow swallowing half his body. For a moment, terror flared. If he went down completely, Emily would vanish back into the white silence. Shadow lunged instantly. The shepherd clamped his jaws onto Daniel's coat sleeve, tugging fiercely until he hauled him upright. Snow sprayed from Daniel's shoulders, his boots finding ground again. Daniel gasped, staring at his partner. "You're not letting me stop, are you?" Shadow barked once, sharp and defiant, then bounded ahead, carving a path. The cold gnawed at Daniel's bones. His fingers were numb, his face raw, his muscles shaking. But Emily's faint breaths against his chest kept him moving. Each inhale was a reminder, she was still alive. Each exhale, a plea not to let her slip away. Shadow stopped suddenly, his body stiff. He barked toward the distance. Through the storm, Daniel glimpsed a faint glow, lights. Flickering orange, blurred by snow. Fire. Shelter. Relief surged like fire in his veins. "We've got it, kiddo. We're close." He pushed forward with new strength, Shadow clearing the way with every desperate bound. The shepherd barked furiously, his voice tearing through the storm like a signal flare. At last, they reached a half-collapsed barn. The roof sagged under snow, but flames glowed faintly from a barrel fire inside. Volunteers huddled in blankets, their eyes wide as Daniel stumbled through the door with Emily in his arms. "She's alive!" Daniel roared. "She's alive!" The volunteers surged forward, clearing space on the floor. Blankets were thrown, heaters dragged closer, hands reaching for the child. Daniel lowered Emily gently onto the makeshift bedding, his hands trembling so violently he could barely unwrap her scarf. "She's freezing, get heat on her now." Medics moved swiftly, pressing warm packs under her arms, wrapping her in thermal blankets. One pressed fingers against her neck. "Pulse is weak, but she's fighting." Daniel's knees gave out. He collapsed beside her, burying his face into his bloodied gloves. Relief slammed into him like a hammer, leaving him shaking. And Shadow, he sank down against Emily's side, his bleeding paws trembling, but his body curled protectively around hers. His amber eyes locked on her face, unblinking, as if daring death itself to come closer. Hours passed inside that barn, the storm rattling the walls but no longer in command. Daniel sat on the floor, Emily's tiny hand clutched in his, Shadow's fur brushing his leg. The shepherd's breathing was ragged, but his eyes never closed. Daniel whispered hoarsely, "You gave everything tonight, boy. Even your blood." Shadow thumped his tail once against the wooden floor, his gaze still fixed on Emily. For the first time since the storm began, Daniel let himself believe they would survive. The barn groaned under the weight of the storm, snow pressing hard against its half-collapsed walls. The fire in the barrel hissed and sputtered whenever gusts slipped through the cracks. It wasn't much of a refuge, but to Daniel, it was salvation, for now. Emily lay wrapped in layers of blankets, her tiny body almost swallowed by the mound. The medics whispered updates, pulse weak but steady, temperature rising slowly, but Daniel barely heard them. His entire world had shrunk to the shallow rhythm of her breathing. And Shadow. The shepherd hadn't moved from her side since they dragged her in. His body curved protectively around her, chest pressed to her blankets, head low. His amber eyes flicked constantly between Emily's pale face and the barn's open doorway, scanning like a sentinel even in exhaustion. But Daniel saw what the others hadn't. Blood. Drops smeared across the barn floor, dark against the wood. Shadow's paws trembled each time he shifted, and when Daniel reached down to touch him, the shepherd flinched. His pads were shredded, raw, torn, and bleeding from hours of clawing at ice and stone. Daniel's throat tightened. "You tore yourself apart to reach her." Shadow gave a faint whine, nudging Daniel's wrist with his muzzle as if to say it hadn't mattered. A medic noticed, kneeling beside the dog. "His paws are bad. He needs them wrapped." Daniel nodded quickly. "Do it. Please." The medic rummaged through a pack, pulling strips of cloth and antiseptic. But when they tried to touch Shadow's paw, the shepherd growled low, eyes flashing. He didn't lunge, he didn't move at all, but his message was clear. He wasn't leaving Emily unguarded. Daniel crouched low, pressing his hand firmly against Shadow's neck. "Easy, boy. They're here to help." Shadow's breathing hitched, his gaze torn between Emily's frail figure and Daniel's steady eyes. Finally, with a reluctant whine, he lowered his head to the floor. His tail flicked once, surrender. Daniel exhaled, his chest aching. "That's it. Trust me." The medic worked quickly, cleaning the shredded pads, wrapping each paw with cloth. Shadow whimpered at the sting, but he never moved, not once. His eyes stayed locked on Emily as though pain meant nothing compared to watching her breathe. The barn filled with whispers. Survivors huddled in the shadows, watching the shepherd endure the treatment, their eyes wide. Some began to cry softly, others clasped their hands together. A woman whispered, "He tore his paws open, just to dig her out." A man shook his head in awe. "That dog bled so she could live." Their words rippled through the shelter, wrapping Shadow in a reverence no metal or ribbon could match. Daniel stroked the shepherd's head, his voice low. "You're more than a dog, Shadow. You're the reason she's here." Shadow licked Daniel's wrist once, then let his head fall against Emily's side. His chest rose and fell with heavy exhaustion, but his ears twitched at every sound beyond the barn walls. Even battered and bandaged, he was still her guardian. Hours dragged on. The storm outside refused to quit. Snow piled against the walls until the wood creaked dangerously. Each gust rattled the roof, scattering flakes through the cracks. Survivors shifted nervously, whispering fears that the barn wouldn't last. Daniel sat straighter, pulling Emily closer into his lap, adjusting blankets. His mind churned, if the barn collapsed, where could they go? The storm had buried every road. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricking. His eyes fixed on the doorway, his body tense again. A faint rumble slipped from his throat. Daniel followed his gaze. Through the snow-filled opening, shapes moved, lanterns bobbing in a storm. Voices carried, muffled but real. Rescuers. Daniel's pulse spiked. They're here. The survivors stirred, hope flooding the barn. Shadow barked sharply, his voice breaking the night like thunder. His tail swept against the floor, but his eyes never left Emily. Even in relief, he refused to ease his guard until the rescuers stepped inside. When the door finally burst open, a wave of snow swept in with men bundled in thick coats and headlamps. Their eyes scanned the scene, exhausted survivors, a soldier crouched with a child in his arms, and a shepherd with bandaged paws pressed close to her side. One rescuer froze, blinking. That's the dog they told us about. The one who dug her out. Daniel met his gaze, voice raw but proud. This isn't just a dog. He's the reason we're still here. And as rescuers hurried forward, Emily stirred weakly, her lips forming a broken whisper. Shadow. The shepherd raised his head, ears high, eyes glowing in the lantern light. He pressed his muzzle against her cheek, and for the first time that night, her faint smile returned. The rescuers pushed deeper into the barn, shaking snow from their coats. Steam rose from their breath, their headlamps casting long beams across the faces of survivors. But their eyes kept drifting back to the shepherd with the bandaged paws, lying against the child as if the world itself would have to pass over his body first. Daniel rose unsteadily, Emily still wrapped in his arms. She's alive, but she's slipping. We need to move now. The lead rescuer nodded. The storm's easing, but it's still brutal. We'll need to fight every step. Shadow barked sharply, the sound echoing off the barn's rafters. He stepped forward on shaky legs, then limped toward the door, his bandaged paws leaving faint red smudges in the snow. He barked again, louder, sharper, his head thrown back. The rescuers froze. One whispered, "That bark, he's guiding us." Daniel's throat tightened. He did it all night. You want to make it out? Follow him. The door burst wide as wind howled through the gap. Snow whirled in, icy and blinding, but Shadow stood firm at the threshold. He barked once more, long and fierce, the sound carrying into the storm like a beacon. The rescuers exchanged glances, then began shouting orders. Form up. Get the sled ready. Keep the fire alive until the last group moves. Daniel pulled his scarf tighter and adjusted Emily in his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, weak and glassy. Cold. He pressed his lips against her forehead. Stay with me, kiddo. We're going home. Shadow nudged his knee once, then bounded into the storm. His limp was obvious, but his pace didn't falter. He carved a path through the drifts, barking in steady intervals, each one a flare in the whiteout. The convoy pushed out of the barn, survivors bundled in blankets, rescuers guiding them, sleds dragging the weakest. The storm lashed at them, but every few seconds, Shadow's howl rang out above the wind, pulling them forward like a lifeline. Daniel stumbled more than once, his legs buckling under Emily's weight, but every time he faltered, Shadow circled back, brushing his shoulder, tugging at his coat until he steadied again. The shepherd's paws bled through the bandages, each step leaving crimson stains on the snow. Yet he kept going, barking and howling, forcing the storm itself to acknowledge his defiance. One rescuer muttered under his breath, awe in his voice, "He's tearing himself apart to keep us moving." Daniel answered hoarsely, "He'll tear the whole world apart before he lets her go." Hours blurred together. The storm fought them at every turn, burying trails as fast as they were carved, pelting ice that cut at exposed skin. But Shadow never missed a signal. Bark. Wait. Bark again. Each cry pulled the convoy like a rope through the white void. At one point, a survivor collapsed face first into the snow. Panic erupted, rescuers shouting, but before anyone could reach him, Shadow lunged. The shepherd clamped his teeth onto the man's coat and dragged him upright, snarling at the storm as if it were an enemy soldier. The man gasped for air, his hands trembling as he clung to a rescuer's arm. If not for that dog. Nobody finished the sentence. They all knew. Finally, through the swirling haze, a faint orange glow appeared. Firelight. The forward camp. A cheer rose among the survivors, but Daniel's chest clenched tighter. Emily had gone still, her breath shallow again. He shook her gently, whispering, "Stay with me, kiddo. Just a little further." Shadow barked furiously at the sight of the lights, then darted ahead, leading them to the gates. His body shook with exhaustion, his bandaged paws soaked through with blood, but his howl never broke. When the convoy staggered into camp, floodlights bathed them in gold. Volunteers rushed forward, pulling blankets tighter, dragging the weak toward the heaters. Daniel collapsed to his knees, clutching Emily, his arms finally failing him. Medics grabbed her instantly, rushing her to a tent with shouting urgency. Shadow collapsed too, but only to Daniel's side. His chest heaved, his paws trembling, blood dripping onto the snow. His muzzle pressed against Daniel's knee, his amber eyes still fixed on the child being carried away. Daniel dropped both hands into his fur, choking on the words. "You did it, boy. You hauled us home." And though Shadow's body sagged with exhaustion, his tail swept once against the snow, his silent vow that he'd never let the storm bury her again. Inside the relief camp, the storm's roar was muffled by thick canvas walls and the steady hum of generators. Floodlights burned bright outside, casting long beams across the snow, but inside the medical tent, the light was harsh, sterile, and unforgiving. Emily lay motionless on a cot. Her lips were blue, her skin pale as frost, and condensation fogged the oxygen mask pressed against her tiny face. Medics worked with quiet urgency, placing heated packs under her arms, checking her pulse every minute, whispering orders in clipped tones. Daniel hovered at her side, fists clenched, jaw tight. He had carried her through the storm, but here, surrounded by hands more skilled than his, he felt utterly powerless. Pulse weak, temperature rising too slow, one medic muttered. "She's on the edge," another said, shaking his head. "We need her core warm faster." Daniel swallowed hard, his chest twisting. "Don't say edge. Not here. Not now." Beside him, Shadow lay sprawled across the ground, his bandaged paws leaving faint red smears on the floor. His sides rose and fell heavily, every breath a labor. Yet his amber eyes never left Emily. When she stirred faintly, his ears twitched. When her monitor beeped weakly, he lifted his head with a low whine. The lead medic turned toward Daniel. "She may not last the night." The words hit like a blow. Daniel's vision blurred, his heart hammering. He wanted to shout, to fight, but his throat only released a hoarse whisper. "She's stronger than you think." Shadow barked once, weak but sharp, startling the room into silence. The shepherd dragged himself closer, his body pressing against the cot's frame. His muzzle nudged Emily's blanket, his whine breaking the sterile calm of the tent. The medic's hands slowed. He glanced at Daniel. "He won't leave her." Daniel's voice cracked. "He never did." Minutes crawled by, each one heavier than the last. Outside, the storm still rattled the camp, but inside, all eyes were fixed on the fragile rise and fall of Emily's chest. Shadow's breathing grew ragged, his paws trembling beneath him, but he forced himself upright. The bandages had soaked through, dark patches spreading across the cloth, yet he stood tall, pressing his body closer to the cot. "Shadow," Daniel whispered, reaching for him. "Rest, boy. Please." But the shepherd refused. His ears stayed forward, his gaze steady, his tail brushing faintly against the floor. He would not rest, not while Emily balanced on the edge. Suddenly, Emily stirred. Her small hand twitched beneath the blankets, reaching weakly toward the edge of the cot. Shadow's head snapped up, and in a heartbeat, his muzzle slid beneath her fingers. Her hand curled around his fur, fragile but deliberate. Daniel's breath caught. Tears stung his eyes. "That's it, kiddo. Hold on. You're not alone." The monitor beeped faintly, once, then again, slightly stronger. Medics exchanged glances, their movements quicker now, renewed. "Her pulse is improving." Daniel pressed his forehead into his hands, whispering thanks he couldn't put into words. Outside the tent, survivors gathered, whispering about the soldier, the child, and the dog who had led them through the storm. Shadows flickered against the canvas walls, the sound of fire barrels and murmurs blending with the wind. Inside, Shadow stayed at his post. His tail gave a faint thump every time Emily's monitor beeped. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but the fire of loyalty refused to dim. Daniel rubbed the shepherd's neck, his voice low. "You gave your blood to dig her out. You gave your strength to lead us home. And now, you're giving her your will to fight." Shadow's ears twitched. His chest rumbled with a faint growl, not of anger, but of defiance. Against the storm. Against death itself. Hours later, the monitors beeped steadily, Emily's breaths deeper and warmer. The medics finally stepped back, their shoulders easing. "She's stabilizing. The worst has passed." Daniel slumped into the chair beside the cot, his head dropping forward. Relief poured through him so strong his body shook. Shadow collapsed at last, his body sinking against Daniel's boots. His eyes fluttered closed, but not before locking one last time on Emily's face. Daniel leaned down, his hand pressed against the shepherd's side. "Rest now, partner. You've earned it." The storm still rattled the canvas, but inside the tent, warmth held the night at bay. And for the first time since the blizzard began, hope felt real. Night fell heavy over the relief camp. The storm had quieted into a steady snowfall, flakes drifting gently past the floodlights outside. But the silence inside the main tent carried a weight of its own, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and fragile hope. Emily slept, her breathing deeper now, each rise and fall of her chest steadier than hours before. The medics checked her every few minutes, nodding with relief as her temperature slowly climbed. Daniel sat slouched in a chair, too drained to stand, but his eyes never left the cot. Every twitch of her hand, every flicker of her eyelids pulled his heart taut. At the foot of the bed lay Shadow. His body trembled with fatigue, his paws swaddled in blood-stained bandages, but his eyes stayed open. Half-lidded, heavy, yet sharp as knives whenever the tent flap rustled or a shadow shifted. He was beyond tired, his ribs rose and fell like bellows, his tail hardly moved, but he refused to sleep. To him, the fight wasn't over. Not until Emily was truly safe. Outside the cot's glow of lantern light, survivors gathered. Families huddled in blankets, children whispering, adults staring at the shepherd like he was something more than flesh and bone. A woman murmured, "He hasn't closed his eyes once." A man shook his head. "He's bleeding, but he won't leave her." The murmurs spread. Words of awe, of reverence, carried softly through the camp. For those who had lost so much to the storm, Shadow's presence was a living reminder that courage still existed, that loyalty could outlast even death's shadow. Daniel noticed their stares. He reached down, stroking the shepherd's ear gently. "They're talking about you, partner." Shadow blinked slowly, muzzle pressed against the floorboards, but his gaze never left the cot. Daniel's throat tightened. "You're not just guarding her. You're guarding hope for all of them." Hours dragged on. The heaters hummed, casting waves of warmth into the tent. The smell of wood smoke seeped through the canvas, mixing with the faint tang of antiseptic. People shifted restlessly, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. But in the center of it all lay a soldier's dog, silent and steady, a sentinel carved from flesh, blood, and will. At one point, Emily stirred. Her hands slipped out from beneath the blankets, weak but searching. Shadow lifted his head instantly, nudging his muzzle under her fingers. She grasped his fur lightly, and only then did her restless breathing ease. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. A child whispered, "She needs him to sleep." Daniel bowed his head, his chest aching. "We all do," he thought. Close to midnight, one of the medics crouched beside Daniel. "You should rest, soldier. She's stable now." Daniel shook his head. "Not until she wakes." The medic glanced at Shadow. "Neither will he." The two men exchanged a look, unspoken respect hanging between them. One had medical skill, the other had survival instincts, but only the dog had the kind of devotion that neither training nor science could create. As the hours crawled, something shifted. The survivors began to drift toward the cot, not to crowd, but to draw strength. They brought offerings, an extra blanket, a cup of broth left near Daniel's elbow, a scrap of dried meat placed beside Shadow. Children tiptoed forward to press their hands briefly to his back, whispering, "Thank you." Shadow accepted it all silently, his ears twitching, his eyes never leaving Emily. And slowly, the fear that had gripped the camp since the storm broke began to loosen. Conversations grew softer, warmer. Someone hummed a lullaby. Someone else whispered a prayer. The atmosphere changed, not because the storm was gone, but because one wounded shepherd refused to stop watching. By the time dawn's first gray light seeped into the canvas, Shadow was still awake. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but they glowed steady in the dim light, unyielding. Emily stirred, her cheeks flushed with faint color now, her breaths fuller. Daniel brushed a hand through his hair, whispering, "She's going to make it." Shadow thumped his tail once, a slow, deliberate sound that filled the silence like a promise kept. The survivors smiled, some wiping tears, others clasping their children tighter. And in that moment, it was clear, the night hadn't belonged to the storm. It had belonged to a dog who watched. The storm had finally burned itself out by the time dawn crept over Miller's Creek. The winds fell silent, leaving behind a world buried in white. The snowdrifts stretched high as rooftops, trees bent beneath the weight of ice, and houses were nothing but humps beneath blankets of frozen silence. But inside the relief camp, the silence was different. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. Daniel sat stiff in his chair, every muscle aching, but his heart lighter than it had been in days. Emily's color was returning, her cheeks faintly flushed, her breaths deeper, steadier. She shifted under the blankets, mumbling softly, and for the first time Daniel dared to believe she would live. Shadow was still at the foot of her cot. His bandaged paws rested on the floor, his chest rising and falling slowly. His eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, glowed amber in the dawn's first light spilling through the tent flap. He hadn't slept. Not for a moment. When the tent flap opened wider, pale sunlight streamed inside. Survivors stirred, some gasping softly at the sight. After endless hours of white darkness, morning had come. Children crept outside first, their breath fogging in the cold. They pressed their boots into untouched snow, laughing weakly as they left fresh tracks. Parents followed, their eyes wet, their faces tilted toward the sky as though they were seeing it for the first time. Daniel gently nudged Emily awake. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered. "Look, it's morning." Her eyes fluttered open, heavy but curious. She turned her head toward the light spilling into the tent. "Pretty," she murmured. Shadow rose shakily, pushing himself upright despite his trembling legs. He padded to the doorway and stepped into the snow, the golden light of dawn striking his coat. His silhouette stood against the endless white, proud, unyielding. A murmur spread through the survivors. Some whispered prayers, others bowed their heads. To them, the shepherd wasn't just a dog anymore, he was proof that hope had survived the storm. Daniel carried Emily to the doorway, wrapping a blanket tight around her. She squinted into the sunlight, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Shadow found me," she whispered, her voice stronger than before. Daniel swallowed hard. "Yeah, kiddo." He did. Shadow glanced back at them, tail sweeping faintly, then sat tall in the snow, his amber eyes reflecting the rising sun. Behind him stretched miles of white devastation, but in that moment, it didn't look like ruin. It looked like a new beginning. Throughout the camp, survivors began to gather around the shepherd. They brought small offerings, scraps of food, a blanket draped gently over his shoulders, a hand pressed softly to his head. Children whispered his name like a secret, while adults spoke it with reverence. One man murmured, "The storm buried everything, but it couldn't bury him." A woman nodded, tears on her cheeks. "He's why we're still breathing." Daniel stood beside Shadow, his chest tight with pride. He rested a hand on the dog's neck, speaking low. "You're not just my partner anymore, boy. You belong to all of them now." Shadow leaned into his touch, but his eyes stayed on Emily. His loyalty hadn't shifted. No matter what the world said, to him the mission was simple: guard the child. As the sun rose higher, the camp came alive. Fires crackled, volunteers shoveled paths, and people began to plan for rebuilding. Yet even in the bustle, all eyes found their way back to the shepherd standing in the snow. He was their anchor, their reminder. He was the dog who had bled into the storm and come out unbroken. Daniel whispered to Emily as she dozed against his chest. "Someday, they'll call this the worst storm in memory. But when they tell the story, they'll start with him." Her lips curved into the faintest smile before sleep claimed her again. Shadow turned his head, ears pricking at her soft breath. His tail swept once across the snow, slow and deliberate, a vow renewed in the morning light. And so the first dawn after the storm didn't belong to the blizzard. It belonged to a shepherd who refused to close his eyes until hope itself had risen. By afternoon, the camp no longer felt like a graveyard of the storm. Fires crackled, pots of broth simmered, and survivors gathered in small circles, voices carrying above the hum of generators. What had once been fear had turned into stories, and every single one of them led back to Shadow. It began with a boy clutching a tin cup of soup. His voice cracked as he told it. "I saw him dig. His paws were bleeding, but he didn't stop. He found her." A woman, her hands raw from frostbite, nodded fiercely. "He barked until they followed him. We would have been lost if he hadn't." Another man, eyes hollow but burning with conviction, whispered, "The storm took everything. But it couldn't take that dog." Each testimony added weight, building like bricks into a monument. People leaned closer to listen, repeating the details, ensuring no part of the story slipped away. Daniel sat near the center fire, Emily dozing in his lap, wrapped in blankets that swallowed her tiny frame. Her doll peeked from beneath the folds, damp but still clutched tightly. She shifted occasionally, murmuring in her sleep, but her color was stronger now. At Daniel's feet, Shadow lay stretched on his side, eyes half shut. His bandaged paws twitched occasionally, but his ears flicked at every mention of his name. Even exhausted, even torn apart, he was still listening. Daniel stroked his head gently. "Hear that, boy? They're writing your story for you." Shadow exhaled heavily, a sound between a sigh and a growl, and pressed his muzzle deeper into Daniel's boot. As the hours passed, the stories grew more vivid. Children imitated his bark, stamping their feet in the snow to mimic paw prints. Parents described the howl that had carried through the storm like a signal flare. Even the rescuers, hardened men who had seen too many disasters, spoke with awe. One rescuer crouched beside the fire, his gloved hands outstretched toward the flames. "I've led convoys through worse blizzards, but I've never seen anything like him. He didn't just guide us. He commanded us. Without that dog, none of us would have walked out. His words rippled through the circle. For the first time, people smiled without guilt, their eyes glowing with something stronger than survival, gratitude. Emily stirred awake, her lashes fluttering. She blinked at the firelight and then at the shepherd resting beside her. Her voice was faint but certain, "Shadow found me." The circle went quiet. Every head turned. Her hand slipped from the blanket, reaching weakly for his fur. Shadow lifted his head instantly, pressing his muzzle into her palm. Her tiny fingers curled around him, and she whispered, "He didn't stop." Daniel's throat ached. He kissed the top of her head, his voice breaking. "No, kiddo." He never stopped. Around the fire, tears glistened on more than one face. The story had been told in fragments all day, but hearing it from the girl herself sealed it as truth. Later, when the stars scattered across the sky and the storm's wreckage glittered under moonlight, the survivors gathered for one last time around the largest fire. A man with a bandaged arm raised his cup high. To the soldier who carried her. Daniel shook his head, rising slowly, Emily still in his arms. His voice carried, steady but rough. "Don't toast me." "Toast him." He nodded at Shadow, who sat tall now, his silhouette framed by firelight. "He's the one who dug. He's the one who bled. He's the one who refused to let the storm win." Silence followed. Then, as if carried on the wind itself, voices rose together. "To Shadow." The cheer rang through the camp, bouncing against the drifts, piercing the night. Shadow's ears pricked. He tilted his head, uncertain, then gave a sharp bark that cracked the silence like thunder. Laughter burst out, warm and fierce, as if the camp had finally shaken off the storm's shadow. That night, as fires dimmed and people returned to their cots, Daniel sat quietly with Emily asleep in his arms and Shadow pressed against his leg. He whispered into the cold air, "They'll never forget you, boy. Not tonight. Not ever." And though Shadow finally closed his eyes, his tail swept once across the snow, sealing the truth. The storm had buried them. But the stories would dig them out forever. The second dawn after the storm broke clear and sharp, sunlight flashing across the snow like shards of glass. Helicopters thundered in from the horizon, their rotors scattering plumes of white into the air. Trucks rumbled through newly cut paths, bringing supplies, doctors, and, inevitably, reporters. The world had heard the whispers. Now they had come to see the truth. Daniel stood outside the medical tent, Emily perched carefully in his arms. She was still weak, her head resting against his chest, but color had returned to her cheeks. Her small hand clutched Shadow's bandaged fur, refusing to let go. The shepherd walked at Daniel's side, limping slightly, but his posture tall and proud. His coat shimmered gold in the morning light, his amber eyes fixed forward. As they stepped into the open, cameras clicked furiously. Reporters shouted questions, their voices clashing with the hum of the helicopters. "Is this the dog who found her? How long did he dig? Is it true he bled through his paws to save her?" Daniel tightened his hold on Emily. "Yes," he said simply, his voice low but steady. "It's all true. He didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. That's the only reason my girl is alive." Emily stirred faintly, her voice soft but clear enough for the microphones. "Shadow found me." The camp froze. The cameras stilled. Even the rescuers went silent at the sound of her fragile truth. Shadow pressed closer against her, his head brushing her arm as though to confirm her words. And in that moment, the story was no longer rumor. It was living proof. By midday, the camp had transformed into a hive of attention. Crews filmed interviews, photographers knelt in the snow for the perfect shot, and rescuers recounted every detail. One pointed toward Shadow. "He didn't just guide us, he commanded us. When he barked, we moved. When he howled, we followed. I've never seen discipline like it," not even in trained units. Another added, when the snowdrifts blocked us, he dug through. His paws were bleeding, but he didn't care. That dog was the difference between life and death. Headlines flashed across satellite uplinks before the day ended. The shepherd who beat the storm. Shadow, the guardian of Miller's Creek. Paw prints that saved a life. But while the world feasted on the legend, Shadow cared for none of it. As journalists crowded closer, he ignored their lenses, their lights, their frantic voices. His eyes never left Emily. When she coughed softly, he pressed against her leg. When she shifted, he curled closer. To him, there was no camera, no fame, no headline. There was only his duty: guard the child. Daniel stroked his partner's neck, his own throat tight. You don't need the world to know, do you, boy? You only need her safe. Shadow thumped his tail once in answer, amber eyes locked steady on Emily. Later that evening, as the helicopters lifted away and the reporters packed their gear, survivors gathered around the largest fire once again. This time, they weren't alone. Rescuers and volunteers joined, their stories blending with those of the townsfolk. One man raised his voice. We've seen storms before. We've seen tragedy. But we've never seen loyalty like his. A rescuer added, when history writes of this blizzard, they'll write of the day the storm buried Miller's Creek. But right after that, they'll write of the dog who dug it out. The firelight flickered across Shadow's fur as he sat quietly, Emily's hand buried in his coat. His ears twitched at their words, but he didn't shift. He didn't need recognition. His presence was enough. Daniel looked around the circle, at faces hardened by the storm but softened by hope, and realized something undeniable. Shadow was no longer just his dog. He belonged to all of them now. As night deepened, Daniel wrote in his weather-beaten journal, his hand shaking from exhaustion. He doesn't understand the cameras, the questions, the headlines. But he understands her heartbeat. He understands my voice. And he understands the storm tried to bury us, and he didn't let it. That's more than legend. That's love. Shadow shifted against his boots, his breathing steady, his body warm. Daniel closed the journal and whispered, "Sleep now, partner. The world will carry your story." And for the first time since the blizzard began, Shadow let his eyes close fully, secure in the knowledge that his watch, for tonight, was done. Weeks passed, and the valley slowly emerged from its frozen grave. Roads were carved out of the snowdrifts, homes were uncovered plank by plank, and families began the long work of rebuilding. Miller's Creek bore scars that would last generations, but so did the people. And through it all, the story of Shadow never faded. Children who had once cried in fear of the storm now played in the thawing fields, stamping paw prints in the soft snow, pretending to be the shepherd who had dug until his paws bled. Elders told the tale at fire circles, their voices hushed with reverence. When the storm buried us, he howled until the world found us again. Newspapers and radios carried the legend across the country. Some called him a hero, others a guardian angel. But for the survivors of Miller's Creek, Shadow was something simpler and truer: family. Emily healed slowly, color returning to her cheeks, laughter to her voice. Yet she never let go of him. Wherever Shadow walked, she followed. At night, she fell asleep with her fingers tangled in his fur. In the morning, she greeted him before anyone else. "You found me," she would whisper, her small voice certain. "And you'll never let me go." Shadow would nuzzle her cheek, his tail sweeping the ground in answer. Daniel watched it all with quiet pride. He had seen comrades in battle, men who had risked their lives for brothers in arms. But he had never seen loyalty as pure, as relentless, as this shepherd's. When the snow finally melted enough for the townsfolk to gather at the ruined bridge, the place where so much had been lost, they erected a simple stone. No grand speeches, no parade. Just a memorial, carved with steady hands. It read, to Shadow, who dug hope out of the storm. Daniel stood with Emily's hand in his, Shadow pressed against their legs. The girl laid her doll at the base of the stone, her eyes shimmering. "He saved me," she whispered. A hush fell across the crowd. Men bowed their heads, women clutched their children closer. For a moment, the whole town breathed as one. Shadow sniffed the stone once, then sat tall beside it, ears forward, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As though he, too, understood. That night, Daniel wrote in his journal again. His hand was steadier now, his words firmer. Storms come and go. They tear down walls, bury roads, and leave scars on the land. But storms cannot erase loyalty. They cannot bury paw prints. They cannot silence the heart of a dog who refused to give up. He closed the book, resting a hand on Shadow's neck. Your story doesn't end here, partner. It walks on in every step she takes. Shadow leaned into him, amber eyes glowing faintly in the firelight. Years later, when the storm was only a memory, children of Miller's Creek still played Follow the Paw Prints. They would howl into the night sky, laughing as they ran through the snow, while their parents told them the story of the shepherd who refused to stop digging. Emily grew stronger, braver. And whenever fear threatened to rise, she only had to look at the dog by her side. His paws bore scars that never fully healed, but his spirit was unbroken, unbent. Because Shadow was not just the dog who survived the storm. He was the storm's answer. And he had one. The blizzard had buried a town. But it left behind something the snow could never erase. Paw prints that would remain forever.